Welcome back. In this session, we'll be pushing a Docker image to an Azure Container Registry. The Docker image will contain RabbitMQ, which we'll use in order to publish and consume messages. So let's start by drawing up what we'll need in order to build this solution. So let's look at what components we need in order to push a Docker container to Azure. Now, if you haven't already, please review the video which I've linked above, and I'll also put in the description. This is my overview of RabbitMQ and Docker Desktop, and using that you'll be able to then step into this particular scenario where we're actually pushing that Docker container image to Azure. So where do we start? Well, firstly, when pushing a container into Azure, you first need something called a container registry. And this, in this case, is an Azure Container Registry. Now, a container registry is essentially, it acts as a place for developers to store container images, like those from Docker. You can simply think of this like a repository for your container images. And once you've created a container registry, you can then look to push your Docker container image that contains RabbitMQ into this container. So here we've now got a Docker image with RabbitMQ. So this isn't live, it isn't running, it's purely just an image. Now there are different tools that can be used to do some of those functions, and I'll show some of these using command line and the Azure Web UI. So we'll use, for instance, the Azure Web UI to create the Azure Container Registry, but we'll actually use command line in order to push the Docker image to the Azure Container Registry. It should be noted that some tasks in Azure need to be completed using something like the Azure CLI, the command line interface. However, where possible, I want to use the Web UI, as it will give you a better understanding of the steps and something a bit more visual in those steps and how they work. But you just need to know that the CLI tool is much more powerful than the Web UI. So what you can think of this Docker image as, it's almost like a cookie cutter. And from this, we then need to create an actual instance of that Docker image. So what we have is we've got the Azure Container Registry, which contains our Docker image, which contains RabbitMQ. And what we're then going to do from that is spawn off a container instance. And it's the instance that is the running container that we'll be interacting with regards to message queues and everything else. The Azure Container Registry is just around holding the images that you can use to spawn those container instances. So we can think of this as the cookie cutter and this as the cookie. Now we understand what we need to be able to create. Once we've set this up, what we're then able to do is we can then create different apps and different services that can basically interact with our RabbitMQ. And messages can be pushed towards for publishing and consumed from one or multiple different applications. In this case, in this particular demo that we're going to go through, it will just be a console application, but it could be a web app, it could be some other service, it could be anything, anywhere. So now we understand what we need to build. So we've got to have our Azure container, we've got to push our Docker image with RabbitMQ, and then we've got to create a container instance. So now we know we've got those sort of three main steps. Let's have a look at how we'll do this in Azure. This always does surprise me that 65% of those viewing this channel aren't subscribed. So could I ask you a favour? If you enjoy the content and tutorials I create and would like to support the channel completely free, please like and subscribe. In return, I'll commit to replying to all comments and suggestions in order to keep bringing new content to this channel. Thank you. Our first step in the process of creating this solution is to log into Azure and to create our container registry. So here we can hit create a resource and we can search for the container registry. Here we go, and then we can hit container registry. At this particular section, we'll then need to create or select our resource group. So I've got one already called demos. And then we need to have a registry name. So I'm going to call this Luke Saunders. I'm going to create this in UK South. And for the basis of this demo, I'm just going to have the pricing plan on basic. Review and create, and then create. And this is now going to go through the process of creating our container registry, which will be our repository for our images. In this case, our Docker image. So we'll give this a couple of seconds and then it should create the resource. There we go. So now we can go to that resource and we can see we've now got our container registry set up. We've got the login or the endpoint for the server here. Now, what we need to do is we need to go and create or enable the admin user, which will allow us to push a container image via the command line to this container registry. So what we need to do is we need to go to Settings, Access Keys on the left-hand menu. And here we've got the registry name, the login server, and we need to click admin user. And that will automatically generate some passwords here. So we can regenerate or we can actually show and copy. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to take a copy of the password. So we've got that ready for our command line. So you'll need to do the same. So now I've got that password, I can then store it. And I know that I've got my login server here, which I can take, again, a copy of, so we know we've got that ready. And then our user, which is, in this case, Luke Saunders. So now we've got this information, there are different ways that we can push an image to our container registry. We're going to use one particular way, but we just want to have a look at the fact that you can actually push the container using the details provided via Azure. So you can use Azure CLI in order to do that. What we're actually going to do is we're going to use the details we've got from the access keys, and we're going to use Docker in order to push the image to the container registry. So let's launch Docker Desktop now and have a look to see what steps we need to take in order to prepare that image and get it pushed to the container registry. Okay, so we've got Docker Desktop launched at the moment, and you can see at the moment I've got a container here, and under images we've got the image that we used to create that container. This was used in the previous session. I've left a link in the description and there's also a link above. During that session we basically built a container image and we created a container that we could run locally on our local machine. What we're looking to do here is we want to push a container image to Azure. Now to do that within Docker Desktop, what we'll need to do is we'll need to open up the terminal. So we'll do that here. What we're looking to do here is we are now looking to launch using the terminal. We want to be able to log into Azure and we want to be able to push a Docker image to the container registry. And that image will be the RabbitMQ 3 management image. So it's the same image that we used locally. So let's look at what we need to do here. So firstly, what we need to do is we need to use the Docker command, and it's Docker space login. And then what we want to do is we need to provide the endpoint for the container registry that we created in Azure. So in this case for me, this was lukesaunders.azurecr.io. So if I do that now and hit enter, it should then check for credentials. And basically, if we've already logged in and we've got an open kind of session ready, then it will allow that. Otherwise, it's going to ask for the username and the password. So here, we know the username is Luke Saunders, and then the password I actually copied earlier. So I'm going to grab that and then I can paste that directly in. Okay, I didn't. Let me try that again. Paste. There we go. So now that's correctly pasted, we are now logged in to our Azure registry. So we've got the container registry, and we've now got access to that. So what do we need to do next? Well, next we need to look at our images. So what we want to do is we want to look at pushing that image to the container registry, but we first need to create a tag. So very similar to the image that we've got here currently, we want to be able to create an image with a tag on it so that we can use that to call. So what we're going to do here is we're going to do Docker, and then we're going to use the command tag, and we want to tag RabbitMQ 3 management, and this again will create a new entry in the images, so it'll be a separate image to the image that we've used locally to create the container. So we want to tag that particular image there, and then we need to provide the Azure Container login server, so I'm just going to copy that, and then we're going to have a / and then the tag name. So again, I'm going to literally call it the same thing we've got now, just to make it really clear. 3 management. There we go. So let's try that, hit enter, and there we go. So straight away we've got no errors, and equally above just popped up now, we've now tagged, and we've got an image now with a tag on it for our container registry. Perfect. Now what we need to do is simply push this to Azure. So to do that, again, we're using the Docker process here. So we've got Docker push, and here we then need to do the container server. So if I do that, / and then this will be, in fact, I'm just going to wipe this out now just to make this really easy. And let's do it this way. So if we go Docker push, we can then, so it's Docker push the container registry server, and then / and your actual tag name there. So think of it like again like a URL really. We hit enter, and that is now pushing our Docker container image directly to Azure. When this finishes, we can then look at opening the Azure portal again, and we should, under our container registry, now see this image there. So there you go. That's happened quite quickly. If you've got larger images or a slower connection, that might take a short while to do. So now let's go into Azure and see where our container image is, so we can understand the next steps in order to then create our container instance, which will be the instance that's running. Again, just to describe what we've done here, we've created a container registry, which is our repository, and we've now pushed an image to that repository. That image is literally just an image. It's our cookie cutter we described earlier. We haven't actually created the cookie, the active running container instance, but we will be looking to do that in our next step. So let's log into Azure now and see what we need to do for that. We're now back in the Azure portal on the container registry, and down here we can see under services we've got repositories. So let's select that. That's just loading up now, and here is where we should then see our RabbitMQ. So if we select this, we can now see that we've got our 3 management image here, and from here we can actually go and run an instance. For this particular image, we're going to go through the process slightly differently. If we use this to create what I would call like a quick running instance, it doesn't within that process allow us to open particular ports or map certain ports. And if you've done the previous video where we run over RabbitMQ and Docker, you'll know that we need to allow for certain ports like the management portal port, which is on port 15672, and also the AMQ port, which is the message queue port around port 5672. So if we run this, we just won't have those ports open basically. So what we need to then do, if we go back to home, we then want to create a container instance. So we can, I've got some of these where I've gone in these before, but I'm going to go through this as if I'm I suppose a new user. Go on here and we want to go container instance. And here we can then look at creating a container instance. So here, container instances, and then we can look at creating a container instance. Now the resource group, again, we're going to be choosing demos. The container name here is going to be Luke Saunders. And this name relates to the actual instance. So we could call this RabbitMQ, for instance, if we wanted, but we'll call it Luke Saunders. SKU, standard, that's absolutely fine. Again, we're not doing anything here that's going to be long lasting. And then from here, we can then look at using or choosing an image. So what we want to be able to do here is we want to be able to select our image that we've created. So here on image source, instead of choosing quick start, so these are just generic hello world ones, we want to choose from our container registry and select the image that we want. Now by default, it's already selected the one we've created because there is only one. So it's selected that image and it's selected specifically that tag. So we might have different images and different tag versions, but we've just in this instance got the one. So we can have a look at selecting the size here. I think that's probably fairly minimum. So yep, that will do for the purposes of this particular demo. We're then going to select networking, and it's here where we then need to look at our ports. So we firstly need to open up the management portal port. This is the local host / and then this port you go to, and then you log in with the default password of guest, because that is the default password that comes as part of that kind of container image, the RabbitMQ installation. So this is a TCP port, and then secondly we need to open up 5672, which is the AMQ protocol, which is around the messaging. So I explained this in the previous video. So the management portal you can use using, for instance, something like Postman, and you can send messages or publish messages using Postman in that way. Obviously, in a live application, you wouldn't be using that. You'd be using the proper AMQ protocol, and that runs on this particular port. So we are simply just allowing both of these ports. Then if I hit review and create, it's going to give us a summary here. That all looks good. And I then can hit create. And now what that's going to do, it's going to go to the registry. It's going to get the container image, and it's basically going to go build this image with these networking ports configured. Our deployment is now complete. Again, sometimes this can take a couple of minutes, a few seconds. It just depends. We can then go to resource, and here we're able to see our public IP address. So for this particular instance, we've got 20.26.88.191. However, obviously when you build yours, you'll have a completely different IP address. Again, all of these demos I tend to build things on the fly. They may well be open or slightly open to the public, but I tear them down afterwards. So if you try and access this IP at the point I release this video, it won't work. You need to go through this process and create it as I have during this session. So I can now grab this IP address and we can look at going to port 15672 to gain access to RabbitMQ, the portal. So here we can see we're at 20.26.88.191 and we're at port 5672. So here I should be able to log in as guest. There we go. So this is all now up and running. But what we need to do here, and what I'll firstly want to do, is I want to delete this user. This is exposed to the net at the moment, so I'm going to create a new user here. I'm going to call this Luke admin. I'm going to create a password for this. There we go. And that's fine. We're going to make this user an administrator. Hit add user. And then I can go to guest. And again, because this user is exposed to the net, I mean, just in case someone's trying to do sort of port sniffing or try and access that, I'm going to delete this particular user. Hit OK. And then if I go back to admin, there we've got that on there, delete this user, that's fine. Oh, cool, that's completely logged me out. So then if I go on here, we go admin. We log in, there we go. So if I go to users now, we have now just got a Luke admin user. Now in theory, we've got this to administer this particular portal. We might then want to add a user on here that's just specifically for pushing, publishing and consuming messages. This is just a demo. I'm not so fussed about that. So we've now got to a point where we've got the RabbitMQ working. We've exposed the management portal now. We've just got the admin user, and I've created my own user and password on here just to protect it while I'm doing this demo. Now what we need to do, or what we will look to do, is we'll bring up a console application that I've written in C# in order to test and make sure this is working. Because right now, all we can confirm is the management portal is there. Yeah, that's great. We can see the standard exchanges that get created as part of the standard installation. We could create a new exchange and go through that process if we want. But what we want to do is we want to ensure that we have properly created the Docker image and pushed it out, which we sort of have here, but we've correctly got RabbitMQ running with both the management portal and the AMQ protocol port open. And that AMQ port of 5672 is really key in order to get your messaging being published and consumed. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to open up Visual Studio. I'll give you a very quick tour of the application I put together, and we're going to use that in order to test and validate our RabbitMQ service that we've got running here. Okay, so what I have here is I've got a very, very simple RabbitMQ sort of demo console application. Firstly, we've got two elements to this particular project. We've got a sender and we've got a receiver. So we've got a sender here which will send to an exchange, and we can send a message here, for instance, hello Azure. All I need to do on this particular example application I put together is I need to provide the username and password and the IP address of our RabbitMQ service that we've put together. And what I've done with this is I've used the scenario of our checkout. So in this instance, we'll, let's say, go, for instance, SKU. We're going to make it a checkout. We can go SKU 12345, and we can say quantity -3, for instance. So if we're going to be sending this to, or our checkout will be sending it, and then our receiver, if we go to the receiver side here, would be basically receiving that message. And we've just got a write line on here of received. And again, we need to be able to populate the username and password and the exchange here. So this is a very, very simple application. What I'm going to do is I'm going to log into RabbitMQ. I'm going to use that to create our exchange, to create our queue, and to create our routing key. We can then use that to populate these particular elements here that I've marked as need to populate. And then we can populate the username, password, and the endpoint here. Again, this isn't a fully fledged application that's meant to be used in sort of the wild, so to speak, because here we're storing things in plain text. This would need to look at an Azure Key Vault or some kind of application setting somewhere. We wouldn't have this written in code because otherwise we've got to redeploy and yeah. But here, at least, it's very visual for you to see what we're doing and where that particular information needs to be set. So let's now go into our RabbitMQ and set up our exchange, our queue, and our kind of binding key, which is known as the routing key in here. Okay, so we're now in RabbitMQ. We're going to create a inventory exchange. Access refused. Okay, so let's have a quick look here. Okay, I know what I've done here. I've given no access to the virtual host. So let's set permissions and then go back to Exchange. So I've just missed that out. So I've not given myself permissions to the virtual host here, which is the root inventory, and then hit add. So we've now got an inventory exchange here. So just to go back to show you what I did there, you can see, can you access virtual hosts? You need to have the roots there. So that's just the case of going to set permissions, and that gives us the rights to configure, write, etc. for the virtual host there. So we've now got an inventory exchange. We now need to create a queue. So we're going to add a new queue here. We're going to call this queue, let's call it inventory queue. That's fine. Perfect. So we've now got a queue. So we've got an exchange and a queue. And now under the exchange, we need to add a binding. And what we want to bind to is inventory queue. And then we need to create a routing key. So what we're saying is we want to bind the inventory queue. And again, this is explained in the previous video, to the inventory exchange, to the inventory queue. And we're going to call this inventory key. Let's make this really straightforward, and then we can hit bind, and there we go. So we've got our exchange, we've now got the queue set up. We can now go back to Visual Studio and use our inventory queue, our inventory for the exchange, and our inventory key for the routing, and to set that application up. So let's do that now. So let's firstly set up our sending application. So we're going to have inventory, our routing key, which is going to be inventory-key, and our queue, which again is inventory-queue. So we've got this set up. We then need to be able to set up our user. So our user was Luke admin. The password on here, I'm going to populate. And then we need to populate the IP address that we've mentioned before from our instance. So this will be our container instance IP address. So there we go. And the port, we know that's the correct port. So if I hit save on this now, what we can look to do is we can look to select our sender application, and then we'll be able to basically test that. So let's try running that now. And that should send one message through. There we go. Apparently that is complete. I haven't got a console write out on there, so let's just close that out. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go back into our RabbitMQ and see if it's populated the queue. Okay, so let's go into our queues, and here we can see here we've got one message. If we go into inventory queue, we go to get messages. We just want to get the first one. There we go. So our sending application is working. Now let's go back, and we should be able to then read from that queue. What I'm going to do here, I'm going to copy this information, paste this in here, and then we can populate the same information on here as the previous. There we go. So I can then save this. We're then going to move this to receiver, and we're going to run this. Run this now. Message received. So it's saying it's received that message. If we now go to RabbitMQ, let's see if the queue is now at 0. So I've gone back now, and if we go to queues, it's completely gone. So what we've managed to do here is we've managed to test sending and receiving to our inventory queue on our AMQ port, which is the 5672. Let's go back to Studio and I can talk you through this application. So let's stop this running. So what we're doing here is very, very simply, we're creating a URI with our user here. And again, I'm tearing all this down, so I'm not so worried about the password here. None of this is going to be standing after I've published this particular video to YouTube. But we've got the URI here. We're creating our connection. We've then got our exchange and routing information here. And again, what we're doing is we're going through and we're receiving a message, and then we are ACKing that message after we've written the message, the received message, to the console application. And it's as simple as that. So we have now confirmed that that works. We would then be able to, in essence, go out into the wild and configure our RabbitMQ to be able to collect, receive, send messages to particular applications we want joining. So as we discussed in the previous video, we may well want SAP to send messages through to an endpoint there, where we can then populate that message queue, and then we can have that pick up. So we can completely decouple systems by using message queues, and in this case the AMQ protocol. Let's say this is quite a straightforward application here for the sending of that, and then or the receiving of that message, and then the sending again is fairly straightforward. So we're setting the same sort of information here. We've then got an exchange here. We're setting it to durable, direct. We know what we've got for the exchange type on this, the queue declaration and the binding. And then what we're doing is we're taking this particular string and we're encoding that into bytes and basically doing a publish. And then obviously on the return back, we're getting back that same message. And again, as we discussed before, we're taking our bytes, we're taking that into an array, and then we're taking the string of that and converting that into a string in order to write that back on. So this, again, has been a very quick session, but it's really around how to create a container registry, how to push a container image to the container registry, and then how to create an instance of that so it's running within Azure. And then what we can do now, and I'll show you it now by going into Azure, we can basically tear that instance down. We can keep the image there if we want, and we can basically recreate as many container instances as we want, and they'll have different IP addresses. We'll need to go through and obviously configure certain things in this particular instance. It may well be as part of the sort of automation of this that you want to set up, and there is commands in order to basically set the user and password up as part of that, so you can kind of contain all that. But I wanted to go through this more interactively so you can get a better understanding of how this is built. So let's go into Azure and tear down this container instance. Now we're in Azure, we could stop that instance if we want. So we can go yes, and then equally we can basically delete it. So we can delete that container instance, and that's now completely gone. So if we try and access the management port for the RabbitMQ, that'll be completely inaccessible because we've completely teared it down. So what we can do now, if we wanted to, is we could go in and create another container instance. So we're able to go through that process. We've still got our container registry. There we go into container registry. So we've still got our Luke Saunders container registry. And if we go to repositories, we've still got the repository there that we can use in order to push this tag to or create a running instance. But this at least gives you a good overview of container registries, container images, and then also container instances. Thank you for joining me on this session. If you have any further questions or comments, please feel free to reach out on either YouTube or LinkedIn. Thank you very much.